discussion question to start things up. What images do you see in your mind's eye when I say ancient Rome? What do you see?
I see chariot.
Yeah, what was that, Fran?
Robes, columns, chariots, gatherings, games.
Yeah.
Games.
What kind of games?
Not so much fun for the participants.
Yeah, right. So you mentioned chariots. The largest structure in ancient Rome was the Circus Maximus, where those chariots would violently drive around in races. What else? Big columns, right? So Fran mentioned big columns. So maybe think of the Parthenon, right? In these areas of Rome with the big giant, right there, big kind of bombastic, huge architecture. Yeah. Other things? I say ancient Rome. You say?
So Pastor, the reality is Rome was a city of 1 million or more people.
Yeah.
And about a third of them were slaves, or third or half of them, something like that.
Yep.
Hundreds of thousands of slaves, and crossroad of commerce and transport and communication. I mean, there's all the military stuff that would have gone on, but I mean, it was a huge metropolis in ancient times, and comparable to any cities we have nowadays.
Yeah, right. So huge metropolis, huge army, expansionistic army, right? Interested in expanding things. Slaves, right? A city really built on slave labor in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Also very advanced.
Advanced. Why would you say advanced?
Oh, they had running water. They had a lot of things that disappeared after the Roman Empire did.
Yeah, right. So think of the aqueduct system, which was a phenomenal, amazing system of bringing water from the mountains down into the city. So the aqueducts, they're still there to today, the ruins of the aqueducts. Besides the aqueducts, what's the other major accomplishment of the Roman roads, right? So the idea that these, especially the soldiers, were extremely skilled in building these roads that were used for over 1,000 years after that they had been built, right? Think of our own roads out here. How long does it take before they need to get another layer of asphalt, right, put down on them? The Roman roads. The Roman roads, some of them are still used to this day, right? So amazing work done by them. Yeah. So we think, especially the idea of these huge, big, giant Roman cyclopean types of architecture, huge architecture. Unlike the Greeks, you know, there's a relationship between Roman architecture and Greek architecture. We can see it in, you know, the columns and the arches and things like that. But the Romans took the Greek architecture and they made it huge. Right, so big, very huge buildings and structures and things like that. Right, the Nazis loved Roman architecture. This idea of extremely powerful, large, kind of impressing in your mind the strength of a nation type of architecture. We think of the gladiators, right? So think of those games. This was one of their main forms of entertainment. Probably historians say the most popular form of entertainment was the Circus Maximus, so the chariot racing, but close behind it was this culture of gladiatorial fighting, right? Which praised the strong and the powerful and the mighty. And you would literally go there in order to watch the stronger ones kill the weaker ones, right? So this idea of like strength and might and violence, that was strength that expressed itself in violence being praised by the Romans. And then, of course, you think of the Roman military might, right? That's Julius Caesar there, and Julius Caesar after conquering the Gauls. And we think of the Roman centurions, right? And the Roman military phalanxes and things like that. Just powerful, expansionistic figures. The word gospel originally referred to the idea, the good news that Caesar has just conquered another land. So when Julius Caesar conquered the Gauls, he would send out the gospel throughout the Roman Empire to let everyone know that that Julius Caesar has just conquered another foe, right? That was the good news, the military expansionistic might of Rome. So here's the big question. So if you find yourself in a culture like Rome, one that praises strength and wealth and might, one that praises power and physical strength like the gladiators, ones that praise military expansionistic kingdom might, if these are the types of virtues and heroes that you hold up, how would you share your crucified Lord? How would you go about trying to get people to put their trust in someone that died on a cross, the most hideous and lowest form of death that the Romans had? How would you do that? And I'm asking you this question. How would you share your crucified Lord to a culture that glorifies honor and strength? How would you share the gospel in that context?
Are you asking, is our culture different than this one?
Nope, I'm asking you to answer that question. Although, of course, there's a lot to learn from this question, right?
So, Pastor,
Very applicable. Murray, yeah.
Something that comes to mind is that, the Romans had this thing about strength and about death, right? About, who was triumphant. So the eyewitnesses to Christ's resurrection, what they were doing is they were showing that Christ was stronger than death and these things that were there. So that put a large portion of it. The other aspect, of course, is that because I just did a quick check, they figured about 40% of the Roman population were slaves. The message that came through about the triumph and the worth of the individual in a society like that ended up resoundingly echoing within the people, because they were not the elites who were living this life and sitting in the upper bleachers of the Colosseum. They were the people who were, mopping the floors and cooking the food and doing everything else, and they understood the other aspect, and their lives were valued under Christianity, whereas they were not valued under the Roman system.
Yeah. Oh, those are huge points, Murray. Good. Yeah, the resurrection is going to be incredibly important, right, to show Christ as a conqueror over death. And the idea of a gospel that sees all people as worth, that Christ has died for each individual, and so each individual, regardless of status, is the value of Christ, right? That's going to be a huge theme. We find that a lot in Paul's letters, especially as he's going about preaching to the Gentiles, right? Good. Other thoughts?
I'm wondering if, sort of on Murray's point, because I'm like you're thinking, this isn't too long, I believe, after Spartacus, and that whole, I'm not sure how many years or a century or so before, but it wouldn't be that would still be well known, I think, in Rome at that point. I'm pretty sure Spartacus predates Jesus.
Yeah, someone Google that. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
But so like that was certainly a big rebellion, and it was certainly put down hard. But you got to wonder if that little bit of a taste for, it's almost like making the way before the word of Christ comes to them. It's almost like a bit of a prep before that. So they might have been a little more receptive to hearing certain things from that perspective.
The revolt was in 73 BC.
All right.
So it was just before. Yeah.
Yeah. Good thoughts. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Did the Romans not make lion food for the Christians at the time?
Yeah. So we generally associate Romans with Christian persecution. The way that it kind of rolled out in history was, if you read the book of Acts, Rome's actually quite the allies of the first Christians. Not explicitly, but they were useful as the gospel was spreading at the very beginning, because they would protect Paul, for example, even though Paul was someone with this weird kind of new religion. His Roman citizenship still protected him. And the Romans would also put down the Jewish people that were trying to kill Christians at that time. So during Paul's ministry, God actually used the Romans to help to help keep the Jewish people that wanted to kill Christians in check. Now, towards the end of Paul's ministry, especially starting with Nero and the Caesars after him, then you begin to start having this kind of open game on Christians that takes place. And so in the second half of the first century, you begin to have the widespread persecution that takes place. And that's where you have Christians being fed to lions and crucified and things like that. That's why so many of the apostles ended up dying, was at the hands of the Romans. So like Peter, for example, who we're going to be talking about very shortly. But at this point, when Mark is getting written, there isn't any explicit persecution of Christians by the Romans, if that's the question you were asking. It's going to be a couple more decades. Yeah. Well, so this is obviously the reason we're asking this question, is that because this is the purpose of Mark. In some way, shape, or form, the earliest church fathers, they saw the Gospel of Mark as something that was written most likely in the city of Rome. At least we don't have any historical reasons to think that it wasn't there, and there's a strong tradition of it. And so Mark himself, if we're asking who this figure was, Mark was not one of the 12 disciples. He's mentioned a few times in the New Testament history books by name. So for example, in Acts 12:12, when Peter realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. So we know that Mark's mother, Mary, maybe one of the Marys that was gathered on the cross. We don't know this, but Mary was a disciple of Christ, and that Mark, her son, John Mark, as he was called, was also a disciple at some point. And so by the time of Epiphany and by the time of Pentecost and the times after that, we have John Mark as a disciple in Jerusalem, his mother Mary in some way having a role with the early apostles. So some church tradition places Mary and John Mark's home as the location for the Last Supper. So that's a possibility. There's really no way of verifying it, but who knows? Maybe it was the case that the Last Supper was actually in John Mark's home. In Acts 12:25, we're told Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. And so John Mark then has this role in the book of Acts. So if you read your book of Acts, his name will pop up every now and then. In fact, there's a fight that takes place between Saul and Barnabas about whether or not John Mark should go with them to do some missionary work. Apparently, Mark let down Paul at one point, and Paul didn't want to bring Mark with him anymore in some missionary work, and Barnabas ended up advocating for Mark and taking him along. Later on, though, church tradition has it that Mark ended up in Rome. And who was he there in Rome with? But Peter. So John's gospel ends with these words. If you'll remember, Peter denies that that he knows Jesus 3 times on Maundy Thursday. So as he's waiting outside while Jesus is on trial and at the house of Caiaphas. And so he denies him 3 times. And we're told in one of the Gospels that after the 3rd time, there was a rooster that crowed, right? The 2nd time, I think. And at that point, Jesus then looked at Peter because Jesus had predicted that Peter was going to deny him 3 times. And so Peter was devastated by this. And who wouldn't be, right, as the disciple of Jesus. Very interesting thing happens then after Jesus' resurrection, where he's gathered together with his disciples. In fact, these are some of the last words of John's gospel. Jesus sits down with Peter around a fire, and they're eating some fish together. And Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Of course I love you, Jesus. I love you." And Jesus then says back, "Well, feed my lambs." And so there's a little bit silence for a little bit while. And then Jesus says again to Peter, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says back to Jesus, of course I love you. And then Jesus says, well, feed my sheep. Then we pick up where we've got right here. The third time Jesus said to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me? This third time, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? Why do you think Peter was hurt this third time?
You know, I just noticed that he called him Simon all 3 times.
Yeah. Yep.
Which again is a bit of that's not an undeliberate thing, because Peter was, rock or solid. It's interesting that he's calling him
Peter,
Simon 3 times in a row.
Yep. So now here he's calling him Simon, and he calls him 3 times. What do you think those 3 times reminded Peter of?
Probably reminded Peter of when Jesus told him he was going to deny him 3 times.
Yeah, right. So here we've got Jesus bringing this up, right? And Peter is getting the opportunity now to confess his love for his Lord that he denied. And so Peter goes on and he says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. And so here you've got Jesus 3 times telling Peter to feed his sheep, right? Reinstating Peter now in this role and relationship with him, showing that he's forgiven and that now Peter will get to have a role to play in Christ's mission work. And so Jesus goes on and he says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And that might seem kind of cryptic to us. So John very nicely helps us out. And he says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. So in other words, what Jesus is doing here is he's telling Peter, who said he wanted to die for his Savior earlier on, Jesus is saying, you will, Peter, you're going to get to die for me. And so when did Peter die? Earliest church fathers say Peter died in Rome, and he was crucified there for his faith. And the tradition is he was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified the same way that his Savior was. He didn't feel that he ought to have the same death as Jesus. Now that's an apocryphal story. We can't prove it in any way, shape, or form. That's just the kind of earliest stories that we have regarding it. But it very well could be the case. And so here you've got, a very powerful Caravaggio painting of Peter getting crucified upside down. So that's where Peter ended up. He ended up in the city of Rome, where he ended up getting crucified. And so it was there then that we have Peter possibly working with Mark, and Mark producing then his gospel based on Peter's eyewitness account. So that's what the earliest church fathers say, is that we call it the Gospel of Mark because Mark wrote it down, but it was based on the eyewitness memories and recollections of Peter, right? And so think for a minute here as we're kind of looking at the timeline of Jesus' life. What events in Jesus' life did Peter witness? Where was Peter on this timeline?
Ministry, Holy Week, appearances.
Yeah, right. All the way from Christ's, not necessarily present at Christ's baptism in John's gospel. We're told right after that baptism, John went and got Peter. So, but very close, maybe days, maybe hours from Christ's baptism, we have Peter starting to follow Jesus. And from that point forward, Peter is there every step of the way. In fact, Peter wasn't just one of the 12 disciples, he was one of the 3. What do I mean by that? That he was one of the 3 disciples.
That he was one of the 3 on the Mount of Transfiguration.
Yeah, along with?
John.
James and John.
And James.
Yeah, James and John, right? So James and John were brothers. Peter was probably related to them. And so you've got these 3 that were, as far as we can tell in the Gospels, the closest to Jesus. He took them aside several times to reveal to them very special things that other people didn't get to see, things like the Mount of Transfiguration. So you got Peter close to Jesus throughout everything in his ministry for the most part, and right there, obviously, in the appearances with Jesus' resurrection. And so we've got just an amazing type of testimony here from him. So that's if Mark was writing based on the testimony of Peter. Again, we can't say that 100% because it's not something stated directly in Scripture, but that was that's what was reported by the earliest church fathers. So, to whom then was Mark writing? This is what we might say. Mark most likely writes to Western Gentiles. So Clement of Alexandria, one of these very early church fathers, records that Mark wrote down the teachings of Peter in Rome. This is supported by the facts. So this is just kind of based on the actual text itself. Mark includes added explanation for Jewish practices and customs. So whereas Matthew, at times when if something very Jewish was happened, Matthew might use, these Jewish terms and just kind of assume that his readers would understand what's going on. Mark, you'll find when you read his gospel, he will stop and he'll kind of give little parenthetical descriptions in order to kind of help the reader understand what's going on at times. He doesn't do it all the time, but he does it enough that makes it clear that he is trying to help his audience understand some things about Jewish customs that they might not otherwise be able to figure out on their own. So Mark includes those added explanations for Jewish practices and customs. The other kind of cool part, Mark stresses Jesus as courageous and powerful, fitting for a Roman populace that valued above all else courage and valor. And so the Jesus that we have in Mark, the side of Jesus that we see, what Mark is really emphasizing is a Jesus that is in complete control of things. And we're going to see that based on the way that Mark kind of divides up his gospel and the shape that he gives it. So what was the purpose then? Was Mark writing? Mark writes to provide a gospel account for the Roman world. And so he stresses at least two things here. There's other ways to go about doing it, but this is an easy way of kind of thinking about it. We're going to see Jesus rules over all things, whether demons, the elements, or disease. So one of the things that's unique about Mark is it's extremely miracle heavy. If you've ever read a red letter Bible, so one of those Bibles that has, in fact, is this one here? Yeah, so the Bible that I've got right here is a red letter Bible. And just for the sake of illustrating this, let me show you here. So is my screen bigger right now? Can you see me? So I've got a red letter Bible here, and I've got it open to Luke. How much red do you see there?
A lot.
Lots of red. In fact, if you go through Luke, there's just tons of red on every page. So the red is what Jesus says. So the words that Jesus speaks. So Luke, Matthew, John, there's just tons of red ink that you would see if you were kind of looking through your red letter Bible. Mark, there's plenty of red. Like, make no mistake about that. There's plenty of red that's in it. But if you notice, like, for example, here's, from Mark 10 here, there's a lot more black, right? And so that black section is descriptions, right? The author describing events taking place. All this to say that Mark especially emphasizes the acts of Jesus, the miraculous things that Jesus is doing. Again, he records plenty of things that Jesus said, but he really puts the emphasis on the actions of Jesus, really trying to kind of demonstrate Jesus' might and power. I got to share my screen. 1 second here. The other thing, Jesus willingly gives himself completely to his purpose of redemption, yet remains in control. So we do have a suffering Savior that gets crucified. There's no question about that. That doesn't change. But the way that Mark goes about, especially trying to bring about these events, is really emphasizing how Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen. He was in complete control of his crucifixion, and he was willingly giving up his life only to take it up again. So these two themes are emphasized in Mark's choice of material. Mark includes the greatest number of miraculous events. So just a couple things to kind of notice as you're reading through it this time. I heard one of our seminary professors once called it's like the action gospel, right? It's just a lot of action that's taking place, showing a God that's in control of things. And so that's why our subtitle for it is that Mark is giving us a superhero Jesus or a epic hero Jesus, right? So an outline of Mark as you're kind of reading it. We're going to go through some of the first lines of Mark here, but Jesus, he just kind of busts out onto the scene. No baby in a manger, no kind of hesitancy on Jesus' part. Instead, he's just going to bust out doing his thing, kind of in control and power. We're going to see him having conflict with the leadership of his time, the scribes, see him with the people. Activity of Jesus culminates, as does rejection of him. But so first, especially those first 8 chapters, there's going to be not quite so much red ink, lots of black ink. That first third of Mark's gospel is all about really establishing this Jesus as someone special and powerful and in charge of things, a very powerful person worth worshiping. The middle, though, chapters 8 and 9 and 10, we're going to see Mark stressing especially Jesus talking to his disciples about the crucifixion. And so the other gospels, they'll have Jesus telling his disciples 3 times about his crucifixion coming up as well. But in Mark, it plays this kind of very important literary role where we've just seen Jesus do all these miracles. We've just seen him in control of the elements and in control of evil spirits and standing up to the religious people. And then he gets together with his disciples and he says 3 times to them, all right, now this is what's going to happen. Let's get down to specifics about what you're going to see taking place when I go to Jerusalem. I'm going to die, but 3 days later I will rise. And he goes through this over and over again in a very short period in Mark's gospel, just especially kind of stressing how Jesus is preparing his disciples for what's to come, letting them know that he's still in control. And Mark's doing this so that you, the reader, so that you know that Jesus is still in control, that he's in complete control about the things that are going to unfold, even though it's going to look to the world as if this Jesus is being taken advantage of and is being thrown around by the Romans and stuff. We already know who this Jesus is. We've seen his power. We've seen his might. He's already predicted all of these things. We know that he's in control as these things unravel. Then we're going to see him willingly going to meet his death, the passion unfolding as Jesus had planned, and then the resurrection of Jesus as well. And so just a very kind of artfully put together gospel here. And so this one, I think especially works really well for sitting down and just kind of reading all the way through, just because it's such a moving, kind of action-packed gospel, and the structure of it just holds really nicely for just kind of letting the next section move as you go forward. So with that, we've got 7:50 here, 10 minutes. Let's take a look at just a couple examples here in Mark's gospel. So we've got Jesus at the very beginning of his ministry. We're right here in Mark chapter 1. This was a Rembrandt sketch that we've got here of Jesus doing miracles, healing people. And the way that it begins then, as he just kind of busts out into the scene, let's just read a little bit of this together. So that's Jesus and his disciples, went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then a man in the synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out. "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. I'm kind of truncating it for us a little bit here. It's a little abridged. Jesus said sternly, "Come out of him." The impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and driving out demons. All right, so how much time has passed since we started here? So the two went to Capernaum. The Sabbath came. How much time passes between this section here and then the whole town gathering together at the door?
Isn't it just the morning to evening?
That's it, right? So this section here is covering a few hours in the life of Christ, right? Now here's the big question. List what Jesus accomplishes, right, in this short period of time. How much time passes? The time of synagogue to the evening. How much does he do in that time period? List some of the things.
He teaches, he impresses people with his knowledge.
Yeah, so he's in the synagogue teaching with authority, right? So he gives one of the world's greatest sermons in the synagogue in the morning, right? That's a piece of cake, right? That's not hard to do. Then what does he do after that?
And he heals many people.
Yeah, heals many people. What else? Besides healing people?
Casts out demons.
Driving out demons. How many people does he heal? How many demons does he drive out?
Many.
Yeah, right? So this is a day in the life of Jesus, right? Within one day, he's teaching in the synagogue. He cast out a demon. He then went to Simon's mother-in-law. He doesn't get much of a lunch break there. He heals Simon's mother-in-law. That attracts a big crowd and heals many sick people, and then he casts out more demons, right? So do you kind of see the emphasis that we have on Jesus here? It's this Jesus that is just extremely powerful and in command of things, right? A day in the life of Jesus, and he's just doing all of these miraculous things, one on top of the other, all these amazing things, one on top of the other. Any questions just about maybe this section of Mark? Again, it's truncated a little bit. Let me give you one more example then. So this is Michelangelo Merisi del Caravaggio. So I guess it's another Caravaggio, but it doesn't look like his other works. Anyways, we've got the calling of St. Peter and St. Andrew, right? So here you've got Jesus. He's the one that's on the right there, and he's saying to the other two, you kind of see his fingers pointing, and he's saying, let's go that way. In other words, follow me, right? Follow me as I'm going that way. So we've got Jesus calling Peter and Andrew. And Peter, of course, had this very, very important relationship with Jesus compared to the other ones where we've just got these very kind of strong emotional points in his life, right? And so in Mark, we have, as you might guess, that very famous time in Jesus' ministry with Peter, where Jesus is talking to his disciple and he's saying, so all the people here in Israel, who do they say I am? What are the rumors going around about me right now? Some say you're a prophet and these types of things. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, well, who do you say that I am? Peter answers for them and he says, you are the Messiah. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So this section of Mark comes right in the middle of the book. It's bridging the first half, Jesus as this kind of epic hero, with the second half, the story of Jesus' trial and death. Why put this right in the middle? What function does it serve? Why does Jesus need to tell his disciples that he's going to suffer? We touched on this a little bit.
Pastor Snoella here.
Yeah.
Is he preparing them for his death? I mean, he spent a lot of time with them. They've looked up to him, and he's going to meet his end as prophesied, and he's prepping them.
Yeah. What's Jesus' behavior, outward behavior, going to be like after this point? How is it different than what we read at the beginning? What's Jesus' behavior like when he gets arrested to the point of his crucifixion?
Very compliant and meek.
Yeah, right? Like a lamb being led to the slaughter, right? He was silent for most of the whole evening, through the middle of the night, through the morning. Very few words spoken. The writers make a strong point of this, where Jesus was not speaking up to the charges that they were putting out against him, but instead he just sat there silently. He had a few choice words with Pilate that we learned from John and things like that. But in general, we have someone that just willingly, silently goes the entire time. How radically different is that compared to the Jesus that we just saw at the beginning? A Jesus that is speaking with authority, right? A Jesus that is casting out demons. A Jesus that is healing people, that is stilling storms, right? And now we're going to see him act incredibly different. And so Jesus is letting his disciples know, right? This is happening for a reason. What's going to happen, it's completely planned. I am still in complete control, right?
Why does he say not to tell anyone about him?
Yeah, what do you guys make of that? So we find this throughout Jesus' ministry. A lot of times he kind of tells them, don't tell anyone about me.
It wasn't a time yet for his crucifixion?
Yep, so it's a timing thing, right? So part of it is we know that Jesus is trying to have his timeline kind of in control. We shouldn't even say trying, he is, right? He's God. Things are unraveling just as they're supposed to.
So Pastor,
with that, go on, Murray. Yep.
They were expecting a messianic warrior to come and take over. So part of it may have been that he did not want them to expect him to take that role. And we see him walking away, repeatedly in the Gospels from that kind of thing. So by kind of hiding where he was, he could continue his messaging without having people supplanting that by trying to make him into a king.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of theologians will point to more than anything else. So in John's Gospel, for example, we find where Jesus feeds the 5,000, and what happens after Jesus feeds the 5,000? They want to make him king, right? And so all the crowds now are pressuring him now to become their king. And so Jesus did not come to start an earthly kingdom at all. And so he spends plenty of time trying to control the crowds, so to speak, because they're interpreting these things in a way that's incorrect, right? So that's one of the things that theologians point to. At the end of the day, we don't have lots. There isn't like a section in the Gospels where it says, and this is why Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. But we've got enough of Jesus struggling with crowds trying to make him king and things like that. That's what a lot of theologians will point to. Yeah, Mike, did you have something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know he's meek at the end, but he's not throwing himself on the ground, pleading his case, begging for mercy, which pretty much anybody else facing that would have been doing, which is exactly why Peter freaked when he saw that. I think Peter really did intend to fight to the death. He was quick to draw the sword and cut the guy's ear off in the garden. I mean, he was ready to go. And I think if he had died in that moment, he would have.
Yep.
But then when he goes and stands in front of them and they're just the mob is now attacking and having their way with them. But for Jesus to stand there and be so silent and not say anything and not give in to it, and just, that's about as strong as I think anything anybody could ever even imagine. Turn the other cheek isn't turning away. It's like, no, get this one too. That's a whole nother level of strong than just meekness isn't weakness, in other words.
Yep, that's what a lot of theologians will point out too in the second half of Mark here, is he's quiet, right? He's, in a sense, letting them do their thing, but he is still in 100% control the entire time. And the big point is he's doing this willfully, right? He is giving himself for us on that cross. And in fact, he's almost leading them along to his own crucifixion, right? And so there's a way that Mark writes it to especially kind of emphasize this control that Jesus still has as he's being led to the crucifixion. It's a stark difference compared to the beginning of it, but it's no less a God incarnate that's in control of things. Good. Yeah. Why is it important for us today to know that Jesus knew everything that was going to happen to him before he arrived in Jerusalem? Well, when he commands us, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. When we see that Jesus taking up his cross was 100% part of his plan from start to finish, that he was still 100% in complete control, how does that comfort us when we pick up our crosses? Our God is still 100% in complete control. And when we willingly turn the other cheek, when we willingly go the way of the cross, as our God commands us, we can have the same certainty that our God is working this out towards his ultimate plan, just as God was working this out in his plan when he was going to the cross for us. So yeah, so much kind of powerful stuff here in Mark. So even though I'm calling it like the Action Bible or the Action Gospel or Superhero Jesus, don't think that it means it's shallow. It's not in any way, shape, or form. It's a very complex gospel with a lot going on. It's just stylistically, it's just very different compared to the other ones. Can you think, who can you think of, or can you think of who in your world today? That's a really bad sentence. Can you think of who in your world today would appreciate hearing Mark tell the story of Jesus? So who can you think of that this might be a good gospel to kind of share with? Who do you know that needs to be told that Jesus is powerful and complete control, has willingly died for them? Again, we get this from the other gospels too, right? So Jesus is powerful and in complete control and willingly dying for us in the other gospels. But it's an emphasis in the Gospel of Mark. Who do you think could use that?
Long list.
Yeah, right. Who couldn't? Especially when it looks like the world around you is out of control. It might be nice to hear about someone who is in control of it all, right? And working through the craziness of this world. So Mike tipped his hat to it at the very beginning. There's a lot that we could say that's similar between the Roman Empire of 2,000 years ago and Western civilization of today, the world that we live in North America and the things that we value here. And if the Gospel of Mark was exactly what the Romans needed, man, this is exactly what your neighbors need as well. So think about that. And the way that I would like you to think about that and the times that I would like you to think about that is as you're doing your next bit of homework here. So just a reminder, I just came across this, thought it was well put. The average American watches 3 hours of TV a day, approximately. Maybe that's you, maybe that's not. I got no idea. But let's say you did watch 3 hours of TV a day and instead you decide to read the Bible for 3 hours a day, for one day for 3 hours. How much would you get done in 3 hours? So he says, in fact, 61% of the books, 92% of them could be read in one day's television consumption. The only books you couldn't read in an average television watching span would be Genesis, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. But it's not that far from being able to read them either. So with that, here's my homework challenge for you this next week. Read the Gospel of Mark in one sitting. This is the shortest of the Gospels, all right? So if you maybe were intimidated by reading a whole book, Mark is rather short. It's only 16 chapters long. It says here 2 hours, but I bet you if you wanted to, you could do it in an hour and a half. It is a page turner. So it is a good short gospel. Then again, you've also got the gospel. It says Matthew there. What it should say is watch the Lumo Gospel of Mark in one sitting, 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours. It's somewhere in that length. So you could do that as well. We talked about that last time. And I just want to add a plug for the NIV Live. If you're trying to maybe, if you want to maybe listen to a dramatized version of it while you're reading the Bible. I just found this out yesterday as I was putting it back on the Kindle that I just bought, the Kindle Fire. The NIV Live app, it's free to download, and you can just use it as an NIV Bible. But with the free download comes comes the Gospel of Genesis, the Book of Genesis and the Gospel of Matthew for free to listen to dramatized. So it's dramatized by they've got over 150 actors, voice actors that put this together, an orchestrated score. It's a great kind of audio Bible to listen to as you're reading your Bible. And Matthew comes with it. Yeah. And so you can.
So, Pastor, one other thing is that the ESV Bible app has a read-along function as well. So if you're in there, it actually will read the ESV text, and that's, I think, the app that's available for your mobile phone and everything else. So
hey, perfect. Yeah,
that's
the ESV.
option.
That's
so
one of
that's
the
from Crossway.
Yeah,
Right.
That's one of the nicest free Bibles, I think. Just the app is put together really well for the ESV Bible. And I didn't know they had that read-along function. So there you go.
I know I've got it on mine, but I'm not sure because I bought the study edition at some point too, but I believe it's available for everything.
Perfect. All right. So read the Gospel of Mark, one sitting. If you must, divide it into two. I'm joking. You can divide it into two. That would be awesome. Just get through it in big chunks, just as an experiment, so that you can kind of feel these themes that we've talked about and kind of feel them a little bit. But of course, again, it takes kind of slow reading and studying of it to get, what you can get out of these Gospels is bottomless, right? I can stop talking. You know what I mean?